ethics and research. Why? Because you can learn a lot when there are no rules, but you can also irreparably damage people. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, but what could we learn? It might be worth it. You're exactly why we have IRB boards, but we'll get there. First, how did we get here where we stopped just trusting researchers to be ethical and we started asking for receipts? You'll never believe this, but racism is a thing. And it's been a thing for a long time. See, now people are racist, but they don't like to be called racist. And they'll tell you, they're like, I'm not racist. But back then, when you called someone a racist, they'd be like, anyway, a little bit more background. You'll never believe this, but sexism, also a thing. And, women used to question men why don't you think women should get a voice in anything? And men would just be like, because they should be too busy cooking. And, that's just kind of how it was. But now we're not like that. Now we have equal pay for women and we have paid leave for things like we don't have that. Okay, never mind. So if racism exists and sexism exists and they're prominent throughout a society, if you were going to say do experimental operations on somebody and you didn't want anyone to care, you would do those operations on black women. Good class, duh. 1845. Often considered the father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims perfects a surgery for vesical vaginal fistulas, which I won't get into the details, you're welcome, but let's just say, not fun. So obviously, if you're gonna go slicing around someone's baby box, you can't use good, valuable white woman baby box, you gotta use enslaved women. So he had their owners send them over, because if your owner says yes, who could say no? And so he operates on these women multiple times until he perfects the surgery. Then he moves up north to New York, and then he performs the surgery with anesthesia on white women, and he teaches the procedure to others, and it's unclear if black women could even be treated in this hospital. Anyway, some people say, hey, J. Marion Sims did these women a favor. He cured them of a painful ailment. But this ailment wasn't unique to black women, and he wasn't playing Gordon Ramsay with other women. Anyway, he got a statue, so I guess. You might also think, well, he's a victim of circumstance. That was the time he lived in. That's how things were. He didn't know any better. And to that, I would say, you're wrong. By 1808, the U.S. had abolished the slave trade. And by 1833, Britain had abolished slavery altogether. And Frederick Douglass and far more prominent white and black people had written about the ethical, moral, and physical atrocities related to slavery. So no one who condoned slavery gets a pass. But let's get focused here. This was happening to black women, so no one cared. The American medical ethics wasn't about to change stuff for women, especially not black women, and especially when it benefited white women. That back then, that was slavery. Ever since we handled that whole slavery thing, we've been the ethical leaders of the world. Less than 100 years later, but close, 1932, Macon County, Alabama. The Tuskegee Institute recruits black patients with syphilis, but do they tell them they have syphilis? No, they tell them they've got bad blood, which could have meant a lot of things. Now, in 1932, there's no cure for syphilis, but by 1947, and remember that year, it was well-established medical practice that penicillin can cure syphilis. Now, despite this well-established cure, the Public Health Service, who was running that experiment, decided to withhold treatment and to convince physicians in Macon County not to treat participants when obviously there was a cure, because they wanted to see what happened. So they watched as these participants died, went blind, or exhibited psychosis. Okay, real quick. While this study was going on, the US decided, questioned, whatever, hey, where else will people not care if we experiment on people? And they got out a map and they were like, those people look brown. And they chose Guatemala. Get this, hear me closely. They intentionally infected nearly 700 men and women, mostly prisoners, soldiers, and mental health patients with syphilis, and infected hundreds more with other STDs. They were trying to see if penicillin prevented syphilis as well as cured it. We never found out because the results were never released. They were never published. But when they stopped this study in 1948, one of the researchers just joined the team at Tuskegee Institute where that study was still running. Remember how I said okay, this is really heavy, hold on. Okay, remember how I said remember 1947? Well, let's talk about Nazis. One of the most heinous atrocities of the Nazi Germany concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau were the medical experiments they did on people, mostly Jewish, mostly twins, including twin children, and I use medical experiments really, really loosely here. The word torture would not be a hyperbole. Okay, so they liberate Auschwitz in January of 1945. So by 1947, they're ruling on the Nuremberg trials, where a tribunal made up of members of the Soviet Union, France, Germany, and the United States are sentencing people who were behind these atrocities and coming up and releasing the Nuremberg Code. And this code explicitly states that voluntary consent from participants are required for human experimentation. It also emphasizes informed consent. It emphasizes the absence of coercion, beneficence, shout out to the Hippocratic Oath. Now, this is a response to phenotypically white people, where, remember, this is 1947. So while the US is across the world, they're chastising people for the exact behavior they're engaging in the US and Guatemala to phenotypically black and brown people. So after 1947, they immediately shut down Tuskegee and made it right. No. Okay, well, it would have taken a year to, treat everybody, wind down the study, all that. Yeah, no. In 1964, 5, 6, somewhere in there, Peter Buxton found out about this study, and he went to his bosses like, yo, do y'all know about this? And his bosses were like, nah, I'm kidding. They got together and they formed a review committee. And that review committee opted to continue the study till they all died. Buxton, the apparently only person with any moral fiber, leaked the story to the press, and the story finally broke, and Tuskegee was shut down, and wait for it, 1972. For context, Lean on Me by Bill Withers was the #7 song in the country that year. But Marlon, these are medical. This is psychology. We would never. I'm coming to your neighborhood, I promise. Let's start with Little Albert, 1920. Little Albert, are y'all trying to tell me it feels ethical to terrify a child to make him fear furry objects? You could have just waited a few years and he'd probably be afraid of rats anyway. Psychologist, now that I got your attention, 1961. Stanley Milgram questions the culpability of German Nazis' actions during the Holocaust. Man, it's almost like I set you up for this. Anyway, he questions, could it be that they were just following orders, being obedient? That's what many argued during the Nuremberg Tribunal. So Milgram puts an ad in the paper for male participants at Yale. And participants are brought in pairs, and they get divided into teacher and learner. This was actually fixed so that the teacher was a participant, but the learner was a Confederate, or part of the study. Now, the learner was taken into a room and hooked up to electrodes. And the teacher was taken into another room with a switchboard that controlled the electricity or controlled the electrodes. The teacher is told to administer a shock every time the learner makes a mistake and to increase that shock each time. And if they begin to refuse, they're given prods or cues by an experimenter that's in the room to continue. Now, meanwhile, they can hear the learner screaming and begging for the experimenter to end the experiment and for the teacher to stop administering a shock. So of course, people filled with compassion were like, no, I get. Now that didn't happen. Actually, 65% of participants barbecued their learner. Anywho, Milgram ran the study 18 times, right? And so there's a lot of different factors that he changed. And it's actually really, really interesting, right? So for example, if the experimenter, who is the one who gives the prods to the teacher, if that person is not wearing a white coat, then the teacher refuses more often. And if the experimenter only gives commands by phone and they're not physically in the room, then the teacher is more likely to tell the experimenter that he gave them a shock without actually giving them a shock, sparing the participant pain. Obviously, they weren't actually shocking the participant, so there was no real pain. Anyway, point is, it's really interesting, right? So you're thinking, this study sounds fascinating. Let's keep it going. Well, no. Why? Because there are requirements to a study like this that we just aren't huge fans of in research, like deception. If you're going to trick people, you You have to have a really, really great reason, a really, really compelling reason, and it needs to be worthwhile to justify deception. The general consensus is that when someone agrees to a study, they should generally know what they're getting into. It is the informed part of informed consent. Secondly, people asked and even begged to be let out of this study. They didn't want to shock this person. They wanted to, generally go home. And sometimes, literally, they were in tears, but they were given prompts to continue. And that's a no-no in research. When someone wants out, they get to stop. Okay, finally, psychological distress. You can't just make people think they tortured someone. It's a problem. They gotta go home and live their lives and I'm a monster. Yeah, it was a thing. Anyway, actually, if you think about it, they were debriefed at the end. They were told that nobody was actually getting shocked. And they checked in with them a year later, and they generally were glad that they did the study. But that doesn't change the fact that you kind of put them through a little bit of a psychological distress. Okay, one last study, and then we're going to wrap this thing up. 1973. Philip Zimbardo is interested in the publicized appalling behavior of prison guards in the American prisons. And so he wonders, were the people who chased down a job like that just cruel and sadistic people? Or was there something about the situation of the prison and being a guard that just kind of led to inhumane behavior? And so he recruited Stanford college students, divided them randomly, some as guards, some as prisoners, and holy buckets of poop and urine did this go sideways. I mean, these generally docile, normal college students behaved like I have to use the bathroom. Use the bucket. I don't want to use the bucket. Shut up before I take the bed out of your room and you got to sleep on the floor. It was wild. So you have guards waking prisoners up at 2:30 to do counts. No one told them they had to do this. And then you have they're making these prisoners do push-ups and doing push-ups with other prisoners on their backs. And the prisoners get upset and they barricade themselves in the cell. And then to get them out of the cells, they spray them with fire extinguishers. And and then they take their clothes and their beds, and so they have to sleep on the hard floor, and it just gets wild, right? At least 2 of the prisoners had uncontrollable breakdowns. The experiment was supposed to be 2 weeks, and it ended after 6 days. But nobody gets a pass for that, because that should have ended much sooner. And Zimbardo watched as these kids, these students, tortured each other. So if you're paying attention, then you're recognizing that if this is 1973, this is happening around the same time that Tuskegee is getting shut down, right? So Congress is taking a look at this, and between APA and Congress by 1974, we're handing out ethical guidelines like hotcakes, right? Things that say hey, if you're going to use government money, there need to be some ethical, some checks and balances, something. 5 things, and then we're done. I'm even going to bring you back up to 2020 because I left you somewhere in 1974. Number 1, if we're going to think about the journey of ethics in research, we have to think about who it has traditionally been acceptable to be unethical to, and what that says about the world and about research. When enslaved Black women were operated on, there was no outcry. When phenotypically white people were operated on in the Holocaust, we got new guidelines. Tuskegee lasted years, despite there being a cure in 1947. Remember, they opted to watch these Black people go blind, go insane, or die. Stanford Prison Study? They could handle watching affluent white kids in distress for 6 days. So when someone tries to say the ends justify the means, you think long and hard about who bore the brunt of that sacrifice for those ends. Have Black lives mattered? So, number 2, the good thing about guidelines is that they're intended to protect all people. So while atrocities towards whites ultimately inspired the most change, now IRBs, informed consent, debriefing, aversion to deception, these things help protect all participants. Number 3. So with all this, psychology has to now be in tip-top shape when it comes to ethics. And we've definitely fixed prisons after the Stanford Prison Study, right? No. In fact, in the 2000s, the American Psychological Association, APA, essentially condoned CIA's torture program. Not torture research, not anything that would make it redeeming at all, just torture. And American prisons to this day struggle to protect people or even subject prisoners purposefully to abuse. Number 4, I think it is important that we reflect on the lessons from research that can no longer be replicated. I hope when you're asked to do something and you feel compelled to obey, but you also feel something in your heart that it's going to hurt people or be inhumane, I hope that you remember Milgram's study. You remember that there were people who refused, and that if one refused, others were more likely to refuse as well. When you're given authority over someone and you feel tempted to exercise that in an abusive way, whether that's in employment, over children, or in a relationship, I hope you think about Stanford Prison Study and you revise your behavior. Number 5, I need to warn you that when you decide to disobey authority to do what's right, people may not clamor to reward your integrity. Hugh Thompson, a U.S. soldier himself, saw the atrocities being committed by other U.S. soldiers in My Lai, Vietnam on March 16, 1968. He dropped his helicopter between U.S. soldiers and these victims running away, and he threatened to return fire if soldiers continued to kill innocent people. He effectively ended the My Lai massacre. He was always a hero, but he was vilified for 30 years just for being honest about what happened that day. So I don't want you to think like, oh, hey, if I do the right thing, people will love this. I'll be rewarded, all this jazz. Or that it'll be easy. Peter Buxton, we talked about him earlier. Peter Buxton, the whistleblower for the Tuskegee experiment, he tried and he tried, but he kept blowing the whistle until someone listened, until someone figured it out, until someone stopped the atrocity. There will always be a cost to doing the right thing. That's why Milgram's and the Stanford study, that's why they indicate that most people just get caught up. Most people just do what they're told. Now we have a lot of people, we have enough people in this world who will be blindly obedient. Think about it. 65% of participants obeyed ostensibly to the most extreme level of pain they could inflict. The world has enough people who will be blindly obedient. What we need is love. What we need is compassion. What we need is more people willing to be part of the 35%.